What a special day it is. And I hope you're happy it's Thursday. I'm coming to you live from northern Israel, where we are, unfortunately, once again in a state of war. And I mean, not that we weren't before, but there was a kind of temporary lull in the active kinetic fighting between Israel and Hamas, and there was a sort of a ceasefire for a couple of months, and then there was also a kind of a ceasefire with Israel and the Hezbollah in Lebanon that has also ended, and the Hezbollah have not at all lived up to the letter or spirit of that agreement. They have not removed all their assets south of the Litani River, not even close. In fact, Israel continues to find more assets there, so it continues to destroy assets there, and Hezbollah denies that they are responsible for the recent firing of rockets from Lebanon into Israel. But it continues to happen. They continue to deny it. There are a number of terrorist groups in southern Lebanon and throughout Lebanon that are capable of firing weapons at Israel. Also, there are a number of groups who are capable of finding arms left behind by Hezbollah in various abandoned posts that various groups might just happen to stumble upon while out walking their dog or whatever. I mean, like, no joke. These things are, just in random places across the country. If you've ever been to Lebanon in any military capacity as Israeli, you might well know this. If you've ever been there as a tourist and somehow been able to tour around, or if you live in South Lebanon, as I know some of my friends do, you've probably seen these things, right? Randomly dug into places throughout the country, where you'd think, well, there's nothing here, and then all of a sudden you stumble upon a big gaping hole in the ground, or a door like just in the ground in some unassuming place that then leads to a large tunnel network or a big bunker or a large base underground. They dig all these kind of crazy things underground because for them that's like the safest place to be, because they think it makes them harder to find. But obviously with modern technology, it doesn't really make them that hard to find, and they just So in any case, Israel is back in the kinetic fight with all these enemies all around, and including the Houthis who are in Yemen and the HCS in Syria. Apparently, Israeli special forces or army or whatever did something in Syria the other day and took out a couple of, let's just call them bad guys, up in Syria. So there's that. Why are they doing that? Well, they're doing that because they want to make sure that the guys that are there are not going to approach Israeli territory with bad intentions. And the reason Israel is targeting specific targets in Syria is to make sure of that, right? Taking out either ordnance or, human targets that are like terrorists, or both. In the case where it's both, it's usually ordnance being guarded by HTS, guards who are effectively Islamic State terrorists, just wearing a different uniform temporarily. And it is, frankly, very disturbing when you consider all these, awful actors that are on state and off state or extra state or non-state actors attacking one tiny little country that, yes, it has a strong army. Yes, it has strong defense capabilities, but ultimately, you know, we are outnumbered here in Israel. So we have to always be on guard to not lose. Right? We can't afford to lose a war. And we have enemies who are constantly attacking us. So our army is good in the sense that it's capable of defending us because it is constantly being tested. And it's not an easy challenge, even though the army might make it seem easy because they have great staff, very well trained soldiers, you know, lots of decent equipment or great equipment, you know, high tech stuff, whatever. But you got to remember, there's also logistical short supplies, right? There are shortages of things people need. It's well known, you know, very basic stuff too. Like we're not even like the lowest of the tech, right? And there's always an ongoing campaign by friends and allies, supporters of Israel, to raise funds, for example, to buy basic stuff that soldiers need. And when I say basic, I mean really basic, like socks, underwear, uniforms, right? In addition to like other basic stuff like flak jackets and helmets. Because the flak jackets and helmets that they're issued, for the most part, are either obsolete or completely useless. Right? It's not even a joke. Like they get issued stuff that was standard issued 30 years ago and 40 years ago. I'm not even joking, right? It's well documented. It's well publicized. I'm not sharing any secrets here, obviously. This is stuff that's, you know, there are friends groups and public campaign groups and public fundraisers all the time for groups of people to literally pull their money together to go buy a bunch of army helmets or flak jackets or, you know, combat first aid kits or whatever they might need, basic supplies that soldiers might need, and they send them, you know, to Israel, to Israeli soldiers through whatever mechanisms they can to, you know, to clear customs and then to clear military inspection and then to get to the soldiers' units and be distributed among the soldiers. It's really bad. For as much money as Israel spends on its military, it doesn't actually arm or equip its soldiers very often. The ones in the field, yeah, like actual combat soldiers, doesn't actually equip them with the necessary standard issue equipment that you would think that they all have, but they don't all have. And it's not a massive army. Like we're not talking millions of soldiers. You know, it's at most they need, you know, look, at most to issue like every possible combat soldier that's not even serving, like 500,000, right? At most, and that's like an insanely high number. That's if you like literally equip every single person, including the logistics people that aren't actually going into the field. Like it's really just, you know, a small number of thousands of soldiers that need this stuff. You know, yeah, and that is, you know, Israel has a very capable fighting force. Like what one of our soldiers can do is the equivalent of like what 20 or 50 or 100 or more of the typical, let's say, Egyptian soldier or, you know, Arab Palestinian terrorist or Syrian soldier can do. Our soldiers have a lot of fighting power compared to the average soldier. But again, if you stick them in a field with a lot of fighting power but no standard defensive capabilities, like a modern flak jacket and a modern helmet, you're really sending them out into just a death trap, right? And you're sending them with all that fighting power, which means it could easily fall into the hands of the enemy. Because if you lose the things you were sent out with to the enemy, well, now they're not supposed to use it in the sense of if it doesn't fit their standards, they're not supposed to use it. But guess what? When you're a scrappy little underdog type of terrorist force, and I say underdog, I mean just in terms of their numbers, right? Not in terms of their financial or political backing from around the world, because in that sense they're not, or in terms of their quote-unquote brothers in arms who support them, in some way, because in that sense they have hundreds of millions, if not billions, of supporters, which is insane that many people support violent attacks against civilians. But when you consider that hundreds of millions, if not billions, of people live in countries where that is the norm, meaning their societies oppress them and beat them and torture them and kill them and make them disappear, well, who is surprised, right? That's the society that they grew up in. Of course they're going to behave like that. Of course they're going to think that's acceptable to do to their enemies, because they do it to themselves more than anybody, right? So, but the point is, when you send out an Israeli soldier on the field, not only does he have to have the best firepower available to be able to do more damage than anybody, because he's well trained in how to do it, he has to have the best defensive mechanism. And when you don't give them that, right, then it creates a grave risk, right? And that grave risk is that the equipment that you give him is going to ultimately end up in the wrong hands, which, if it does, can cause really catastrophic failures, right? It can cause failures of a proportion and a magnitude that are kind of hard to imagine. Like, imagine a Palestinian actually armed with all the same tech, offensive tech, and offensive ordnance that a typical Israeli infantryman has. They could do a lot of damage. And thank God they don't have that for their standard issue, right? And thank God they don't really have a standard issue. They're just a bunch of terrorist monkeys running around. They're terrorist fleeing soldiers. They're not really soldiers. They're not uniformed. They don't have a uniform code of conduct. They don't even wear uniforms ever when they're fighting, because they want to be not identifiable. To them, to them, they want to be unidentifiable in order to be harder to catch, in order to be harder to shoot at, right? The reason that a uniformed army and a well-regulated army wears uniforms isn't to make their soldiers easier to shoot at, but it's to make it so that they are identifiable, so that the enemy cannot legitimately say that they shot at civilians by mistake. No, because you should only be targeting people in uniforms, right? Now, of course, there are special operations units in a well-regulated army and all these other kind of exceptions to the rule, but special forces units that operate outside of uniforms usually are doing so in specific covert operations in which there are no other civilians at risk on their side of the conflict, and the civilians that are at risk on the target side of the conflict, well, A, that's not great. It's terrible. But B, the special operators usually are well trained. If they're in a good unit, they're usually well trained to identify the civilians who should not be harmed and separate them from the bad actors who may need to be harmed or even eliminated, right? Now, why am I talking about this like this? Well, all this is coming around. Don't worry. What we have is in Gaza right now. Like I said, there's an active war again in Gaza, and the Gazans know this, and the Hamas knows this, and the Hamas is scared to death, literally. They know the end is nigh for them. They know death is coming for them, and they are scared to death, and they don't know what to do. They may have some hostages still alive. They released some videos recently of some Israeli hostages begging for their life and begging the Israeli government to free them, which is just absolutely horrible that they are keeping hostages. And the way that they abuse them and torture them and all these other, it's just unimaginable. It's horrible, and we have to hope and pray that these guys and girls come home alive. Men and women, of all ages that they're holding. We really have to hope and pray that they will come home alive and that they'll be able to recover from their trauma. Although, once you go through something like that, it is easy to comprehend why you never fully recover from that. But right now, we see the Hamas is scared shitless, basically, to put it point blank. And in order to avoid being vaporized completely and to get in their permanent dirt naps, these pretend jihadis who always glorify, oh, we all want to die for Allah. Apparently not, because it seems that now they've organized anti-Hamas rallies in Gaza. You heard that right. Hamas has organized anti-Hamas rallies in Gaza. They have sent the word out to the people in Gaza that the people in Gaza have to get out and protest Hamas and demand an end to the war and demand the uprooting of Hamas from power. But wait a minute, Yash, it doesn't make any sense. Why would they want to get rid of their own power? They want to get rid of their own power because they want to show they don't actually want to get rid of their own power, okay? They want to show that the people of Hamas are reasonable and peaceful and they want peace. They want to show that the people of Gaza are sick of Hamas and they want a better way of governance. They want to show all that in order to convince the idiots who support Hamas and the Palestinians in Gaza, who were part and parcel of the October 7th attack. I remind you, non-Hamas people took part in those actions directly. The Bibas family was kidnapped. The mother and the babies were kidnapped by non-quote-unquote terrorists, right? Just by regular Palestinian civilians who were terrorizing that day. So when you say Gazans are not all Hamas, well, they may not all be Hamas, but they are certainly largely terrorists. They largely support Hamas. Not one has been willing to take a $5 million offer. $5 million for information that may lead, not has to lead, may lead to the whereabouts of the hostages. Not one person. And that offer has been on the table for a very long time by Israel. $5 million. And basically you get a witness protection program type of deal where they give you a new identity, set you up in a new life, in a new place. You're hooked up with cash, all the cash you could ever need. $5 million is a hell of a lot of money for somebody coming out of Gaza. They get to take themselves and their family with them. Not a single one has taken that offer. Not one. Right? So don't tell me that they're not Palestinians who are not in Hamas who are terrorists. They are terrorists. The vast majority of them are. Yeah, I know there may be some. I know there are some. Because I know some who are not terrorists and who really want peace with Israel. And I feel for you, men and women. I feel for you. It's an awful thing you're going through. But you guys, I'm not talking about you individually, but you guys, as a group, you done effed around, and now you're going to find out. Because you refuse to get rid of that cancer that is Hamas. You let it grow, you let it turn your strip of land into a hellhole, a terrorist base. Instead of turning it into a country, you let them turn it into a terror base. You didn't have the courage, you didn't have the balls to stand up to them, even if it would cost you your life. You didn't have the balls to do it. You let them run the roost over you. You let them control you. You let them debase you and humiliate you and control you. So I don't know what the deal is with you guys, but you have not done the things you need to do, and now you're being forced out into the streets to protest Hamas. And we know it's Hamas agents provocateurs who are making you do it. We know that. It's very obvious. You can't fool us. Sorry, Broham. It's clear as day to us that you're being told by Hamas, go out in the street to protest Hamas and to demand more freedom and all this stuff. And you'll see. That's called a psyops to control your opposition. And then you'll see by the end of the week, after the news has reported this as if it's some kind of a big deal, they did 2, maybe 3 days of it. You'll see by the weekend, when they have their big celebratory meals after their Ramadan fasting and all that is done, you'll see they'll forget to report about that. They'll do some stories about, the end of Ramadan or the end of the fast each day, all that kind of stuff. And then they'll quickly forget about all the bad things and about all the protests, and they'll just report about the nonsense, right? So, don't be duped by the very obviously fake info, right? Don't fall for it, because that's exactly what's happening there. All right, I'll catch you guys later. Peace.